The night was quiet, the kind of quiet that makes you think everything is exactly as it should be. Keisha Williams had just finished a 12-hour shift at the law firm where she worked as a paralegal. Her feet hurt, her eyes were tired, and all she wanted was to get home, take a hot shower, and fall into bed. She was 24 years old, living in a small apartment on the east side of Baltimore. Life wasn't easy, but she was making it work. She had dreams bigger than her current situation. Law school applications sat on her kitchen table, half-finished but full of hope. Every night shift, every long hour, every difficult day was just another step toward something greater. Keisha pulled out of the parking garage and turned onto the main road. The streets were mostly empty at this hour. Just a few cars here and there, their headlights cutting through the darkness. She turned on the radio, letting some soft music fill the silence. Her mind drifted to the weekend ahead. Maybe she would finally have time to finish those applications. That's when she saw the flashing lights in her rearview mirror. At first, she didn't think much of it. She checked her speedometer. She was going exactly the speed limit. Her registration was current. Her license was valid. She had done nothing wrong. The police car was probably just passing through, heading somewhere else. But then the siren came on, short and sharp, and the patrol car pulled up right behind her. Keisha's heart started beating a little faster, but she told herself to stay calm. She had been pulled over before, once or twice over the years, for minor things. A broken taillight, a rolling stop at a sign. Nothing serious. She knew what to do. Be polite, be cooperative. Keep your hands visible. Answer questions clearly. She pulled over to the side of the road and put the car in park. She rolled down her window and placed her hands on the steering wheel where they could be seen. The cold night air rushed in, making her shiver slightly. 2 officers approached her car, one on each side. Their flashlights were bright, blinding her as they pointed them into her face and around the interior of her vehicle. The officer at her window was a tall man with a hard expression. He didn't greet her or explain why he had pulled her over. He just stared at her for a long moment, like he was trying to figure something out. "License and registration," he said finally. Keisha nodded slowly. "I'm going to reach into my purse for my wallet," she said, making sure to announce every movement. She had learned to do this. It was safer this way. "My registration is in the glove compartment." She moved carefully, pulling out her license first, then leaning over to get her registration papers. She handed both documents to the officer. He looked at them, then looked back at her. "This your car?" "Yes, sir," Keisha said. "I've had it for 3 years. Bought it used from a dealership over on Franklin Street." The officer didn't respond. He walked back to his patrol car with her documents, leaving her sitting there in the cold. Minutes passed. 5 minutes. Then 10. Keisha watched in her side mirror as the 2 officers talked, occasionally glancing back at her car. Something felt wrong. When the officer returned, his whole demeanor had changed. He was tense now, his hand resting near his belt. "Step out of the vehicle," he ordered. Keisha's stomach dropped. "Can I ask what this is about?" "I don't understand what I did wrong." "I said step out of the vehicle, now." She didn't argue. She couldn't afford to argue. She opened her door slowly and stepped out onto the pavement. The cold hit her immediately, cutting right through her work clothes. "This vehicle matches the description of a car reported stolen earlier tonight," the officer said. Keisha felt like the ground had shifted beneath her feet. "That's not possible. This is my car. I have all the paperwork. I can show you the title, the insurance, everything. Turn around and put your hands behind your back. Please, there has to be some mistake. I'm a paralegal. I work at Henderson and Associates downtown. You can call them. You can verify everything. This is my car." But the officer wasn't listening. Before Keisha could say another word, she felt her arms being pulled behind her back. Cold metal clicked around her wrists. Handcuffs. She was being handcuffed on the side of the road like a criminal. "You have the right to remain silent," the officer began, reciting words that Keisha knew by heart from her work. Words she had read in countless case files. Words she never imagined would be directed at her. The other officer was already searching her car, pulling things out of the glove compartment, checking under the seats. She watched helplessly as her personal belongings were handled by strangers. Her privacy stripped away in the middle of the night on an empty street. They put her in the back of the patrol car. The seats were hard plastic, designed to be uncomfortable. There was a metal grate separating her from the front. She could smell old sweat and something chemical, like cleaning fluid that couldn't quite cover up whatever had been there before. Kaisha's mind was racing. This had to be a mistake. It had to be? Her car wasn't stolen. She had every document to prove it. Once they checked, once they actually looked at the paperwork, they would see the truth. They would apologize and let her go. This would all be over in an hour, maybe two. She held on to that thought as the patrol car pulled away from her vehicle, leaving it sitting abandoned on the side of the road. The drive to the detention center took about 20 minutes. Kaisha tried to stay calm, tried to remember her training. Because here's the thing that the officers didn't know, the thing that would change everything about what happened next. 3 months earlier, Kaisha had been selected for a special program, a federal training initiative designed to identify civil rights violations in detention facilities. She had applied on a whim, not really expecting to be chosen. But something in her application had caught their attention. Her background in law, her attention to detail, her ability to stay composed under pressure. For 8 weeks she had learned things that most people never think about. How to document misconduct without paper or pen. How to memorize details that could later be used as evidence. How to recognize patterns of abuse that might look like isolated incidents to untrained eyes. How to survive situations designed to break you down. She had been trained by federal investigators, civil rights attorneys, and experts who had spent decades fighting institutional corruption. They had taught her that the most powerful weapon against injustice wasn't anger or force. It was information. It was memory. It was the ability to turn your own experience into undeniable evidence. Kaisha had completed the program just 2 weeks ago. She had been proud of herself, but she never imagined she would need to use what she learned so soon. Certainly not like this. As the patrol car pulled into the detention center parking lot, Kaisha made a decision. She would not panic. She would not lose control. She would do exactly what she had been trained to do. She started paying attention to everything. The time on the dashboard clock when they arrived. The badge numbers of the officers who had arrested her. The exact words they had used. The layout of the building as they walked her inside. The names on the doors they passed. The booking officer barely looked at her as she was processed. He typed slowly on an old computer, asked her questions in a bored voice, and made no effort to investigate her claims about the car. When she asked to make a phone call, he told her she would have to wait. She waited. Hours passed. No phone call came. Her paperwork seemed to disappear into a black hole. Nobody could tell her what was happening or how long she would be held. Every time she asked a question, she was told to be patient. Every time she mentioned her rights, she was ignored. They put her in a holding cell by herself. The walls were gray concrete. There was a metal bench bolted to the floor and a toilet in the corner with no privacy screen. The overhead light buzzed with a constant electric hum that burrowed into her skull. Kaisha sat down on the cold metal bench and closed her eyes. She took a deep breath. Then another. She knew this was just the beginning. She didn't know yet how bad things were going to get over the next 72 hours. But she knew one thing for certain. She was going to remember everything. The first night was the longest of Kaisha's life. She sat on that metal bench in the holding cell, watching the hours crawl by through a small window that showed nothing but a dark hallway. Nobody came to check on her. Nobody answered when she called out. It was like she had been dropped into a hole and forgotten. Around 3 a.m, she finally fell asleep sitting up, her back against the cold concrete wall. She woke up an hour later with a stiff neck and a deep ache in her shoulders from the way. Her hands had been cuffed behind her back during the arrest. The cuffs were off now, but her wrists still had red marks where the metal had dug into her skin. When morning came, she expected things to get better. Surely someone would review her case. Surely someone would realize the mistake. Surely her family had noticed she never came home and was looking for her by now, but morning brought no answers. A guard came by and pushed a tray of food through a slot in the door. Cold oatmeal and a carton of milk that was slightly warm. Keisha hadn't eaten since lunch the day before, so she forced herself to eat even though her stomach was twisted with anxiety. She asked the guard about her phone call. He shrugged and walked away without a word. By noon, Keisha had been in custody for over 12 hours, and still nobody had told her family where she was. This was a clear violation of her rights. She knew this. She had studied cases exactly like this at the law firm. Detainees were supposed to be allowed to contact someone within a reasonable time. 12 hours was not reasonable. She started keeping track in her head. Every violation, every ignored request, every minute that passed without proper procedure being followed. Around 2 in the afternoon, things changed. A different guard appeared at her cell door. He was an older man with graying hair and a face that looked like it had forgotten how to smile a long time ago. His name tag read Officer Dalton. He unlocked the door and told her to step out. For a moment, Keisha felt hope rise in her chest. Maybe they had finally sorted out the mistake. Maybe she was being released. Instead, Officer Dalton led her down a long hallway to a different part of the facility. The lights here were dimmer. The air was colder. They stopped in front of a heavy metal door. "Solitary," he said, pulling the door open. Keisha stared at him. "Why? I haven't done anything." "I've been cooperative. I haven't caused any trouble." Officer Dalton's expression didn't change. "Administrative decision. You'll be here until further notice." The room was smaller than the holding cell. Much smaller. There was a thin mattress on a concrete slab, a toilet, and a sink. Nothing else. No window, no clock. Just 4 gray walls and a single light fixture behind a metal cage in the ceiling. Keisha stepped inside, and the door slammed shut behind her with a sound that echoed in her bones. She stood in the middle of that tiny room and forced herself to breathe. In through her nose, out through her mouth, just like they had taught her in the training program. Stay calm, stay focused. Don't let them see you break. The hours that followed tested everything she had learned. The temperature in the cell dropped as evening came. Keisha had only her work clothes, a thin blouse and dress pants. No jacket, no blanket. She curled up on the mattress, which was barely thicker than a folded towel, and wrapped her arms around herself to try to keep warm. She didn't sleep that night. The cold wouldn't let her. Every time she started to drift off, a shiver would run through her body and wake her up again. By morning, her teeth were chattering and her fingers had gone numb when a guard came by with breakfast. Keisha asked for a blanket. The guard, a young woman who wouldn't meet her eyes, said she would check on it. The blanket never came. Lunch didn't come either. Keisha waited, her stomach growling, watching the slot in the door. Nothing. She called out, asking if someone had forgotten her meal. No response. By dinner time, she had gone almost 24 hours without food. When a tray finally appeared, it held only a small portion of rice and a few pieces of overcooked vegetables. She ate every bite, even though it was barely enough to take the edge off her hunger. That night, Officer Dalton came back. He stood outside her cell door, looking at her through the small window. There was something in his eyes that made Keisha's skin crawl. Not anger exactly. Something worse, enjoyment. "Comfortable in there?" he asked. Keisha didn't answer. She had learned a long time ago that some questions were traps. "You know, we don't get many college girls in here," he continued. "Most of them know their place, know how to stay out of trouble. But you think you're special, don't you? Think your fancy education makes you better than everybody else." Still, Keisha said nothing. She kept her face neutral, her breathing steady. Inside, her heart was pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat. Officer Dalton smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "We'll see how special you feel after a few more days." He walked away, his footsteps fading down the hallway. Keisha sat down on her mattress and closed her eyes. She brought up his face in her mind. The lines around his eyes, the shape of his jaw, the exact words he had used. She filed it all away. Adding it to the growing catalog of evidence she was building in her memory, the next day brought more of the same. Meals that were late or missing entirely. Requests for basic necessities that were ignored. The cold that never let up. But there was something else now. Officer Dalton had made her a target, and the other guards seemed to follow his lead. When Keisha asked to use the bathroom facilities in the common area, they made her wait for hours. When she asked about her case status, they laughed and told her she wasn't a priority. One guard, a heavy-set man with a buzz cut, made comments about her appearance every time he walked by. He never touched her, never did anything that would leave a mark, but his words were designed to humiliate, to make her feel small, to remind her that in here she had no power. Keisha absorbed it all. Every comment, every guard's name and badge number, every timestamp she could estimate based on meal schedules and shift changes. On her second night in solitary, something unexpected happened. A voice came through the wall. Soft, barely above a whisper. "Hey, you okay in there?" Keisha moved closer to the wall. There was a small vent near the floor, and the voice was coming through it. Another detainee in the cell next door. "I'm alive," Keisha whispered back. "Who are you?" "Doesn't matter. I've been here 6 months. Just wanted to tell you, you're not the first." Keisha felt her chest tighten. "What do you mean?" "The way they're treating you. The solitary for no reason. The food games. Dalton and his crew. They do this to people, especially people like us. People who don't have anyone on the outside making noise. Has anyone reported it?" There was a long pause. "A few have tried. Nothing ever happens. The complaints disappear. People get scared. Or they get released and just want to forget. Nobody wants to fight a system this big." Keisha pressed her palm against the cold wall. "How many? In the time I've been here?" "At least a dozen that I know of. Probably more." That number hit Keisha like a punch to the stomach. This wasn't random. This wasn't a few bad guards having a bad day. This was a pattern. A system of abuse that had been running for who knows how long, hidden behind concrete walls and official procedures. She thought about her training, about why she had been selected for that program in the first place. The federal investigators had told her that the hardest part of fighting institutional corruption was getting reliable testimony. Victims were often too traumatized to remember details clearly, too scared to come forward, too worn down to fight. But Keisha wasn't worn down. Not yet. And she was remembering everything. On the third day, Officer Dalton came back with news. They had finally verified that her car wasn't stolen. A clerical error, he said, like it was nothing. Like the past 72 hours had just been a minor inconvenience. "You're free to go," he told her, unlocking her cell door. "Try to stay out of trouble." Keisha walked out of that cell on shaking legs. She was exhausted, hungry, cold to her core, and something inside her had changed. But she didn't let any of that show on her face. She kept her expression calm as they processed her release. She signed the papers they put in front of her. She collected her belongings, and when she walked out the front door of that detention center into the bright morning sunlight, she didn't go home. She had somewhere else to be first. The sunlight felt strange on Keisha's skin. After 3 days in that cold, windowless cell, the warmth of the morning sun was almost overwhelming. She stood outside the detention center for a moment, just breathing in the fresh air, letting herself feel something other than concrete walls and fluorescent lights. Her phone had been returned to her along with her other belongings. She turned it on and watched as notification after notification flooded the screen. Missed calls from her mother, text messages from her sister, voicemails from her boss at the law firm. Everyone had been looking for her. Everyone had been worried sick. She wanted to call them back. She wanted to hear her mother's voice and tell her she was okay, but that would have to wait. There was something she needed to do first while everything was still fresh in her mind. While every detail was still sharp and clear, Keisha called a taxi and gave the driver an address on the other side of the city, the regional FBI field office. During the ride, she sat in the back seat and stared out the window at the city passing by. People were going about their normal lives, walking to work, waiting at bus stops, drinking coffee on sidewalk benches. They had no idea what was happening inside that detention center just a few miles away. No idea that people were being mistreated behind those walls while the rest of the world carried on like nothing was wrong. The taxi pulled up to a tall government building with American flags hanging outside. Keisha paid the driver and walked up the front steps. Her legs still felt weak from 3 days of barely eating, but she kept moving forward. She had come too far to stop now. Inside, she approached the front desk and asked to speak with someone from the Civil Rights Division. The receptionist looked at her with a mixture of curiosity and concern. Keisha knew she must look rough. Wrinkled clothes, dark circles under her eyes, hair that hadn't been properly washed in days. "Do you have an appointment?" the receptionist asked. "No, but I was a participant in the Federal Civil Rights Observer Training Program. Cohort 7. My program coordinator was Agent Diane Foster. If you contact her office, she verify who I am." The receptionist's eyebrows went up slightly. She made a phone call, speaking quietly into the receiver. A few minutes later, she directed Keisha to take a seat and wait. 20 minutes passed. Then a door opened and a woman in a dark suit walked out. She was in her 50s, with silver-streaked hair pulled back in a neat bun. Her eyes were sharp and intelligent, taking in every detail of Keisha's appearance in a single glance. "Keisha Williams," the woman said. It wasn't a question. "I'm Agent Foster. We met during your training." Keisha stood up. "I remember. You gave the lecture on documentation methods." Agent Foster nodded slowly. Her expression was serious but not unkind. "You look like you've been through something. Come with me." She led Keisha down a long hallway and into a small conference room. There was a table in the center with chairs around it, and a large mirror on one wall that Keisha knew was probably a two-way observation window. Agent Foster closed the door and gestured for Keisha to sit down. "Tell me everything," she said. And Keisha did. She started from the beginning. The traffic stop. The false accusation about the stolen car. The arrest. She described the booking process, the hours without a phone call, the way her paperwork seemed to vanish into thin air. She talked about being moved to solitary confinement without explanation. The cold, the hunger. The guards who seemed to take pleasure in her suffering. She gave names. Badge numbers, timestamps, exact quotes from conversations. She described the layout of the facility, the shift change patterns she had observed, the specific policies that had been violated. Agent Foster listened without interrupting. She took notes on a yellow legal pad, her pen moving steadily across the paper. Every now and then she would ask a clarifying question. "What time did that happen? Can you describe the guard's appearance? How long were you in that particular area?" Keisha answered every question with precision. This was what she had been trained for. This was why she had forced herself to stay calm during those 3 terrible days. Every moment of suffering had been converted into evidence. Every injustice had been recorded in her memory like files in a cabinet, ready to be pulled out and examined. When she got to the part about the voice through the vent, the other detainee who had told her she wasn't the first, Agent Foster stopped writing. "This person said there were others? At least a dozen?" That's what she said. People who had been treated the same way. People who had tried to report it but nothing happened. Agent Foster leaned back in her chair. Her expression had changed. There was something in her eyes now that looked like controlled anger. "We've had suspicions about that facility for a while. Complaints that seemed credible but never went anywhere. Witnesses who would start to cooperate and then suddenly change their minds or disappear. Someone is protecting them," Keisha said. It wasn't a question. "That's what we've suspected. But suspicion isn't evidence. We needed someone on the inside. Someone who could document what was actually happening and be willing to testify." Agent Foster looked at Keisha with something that might have been respect. "We never intended for you to be that person. Not like this. No, but I am now." Agent Foster was quiet for a moment. Then she stood up and walked to the door. Wait here. I need to make some calls. She was gone for almost an hour. Keisha sat alone in the conference room, her exhaustion finally catching up with her. She rested her head on her arms and closed her eyes, not quite sleeping but not fully awake either. Her mind kept replaying scenes from the detention center. The cold cell. Officer Dalton's smile. The whispered voice through the vent. When Agent Foster returned, she wasn't alone. 2 other people came in with her. A man in his 40s with a serious face and a younger woman carrying a laptop. Keisha, this is Agent Chun and Agent Rodriguez from our investigative team. I've briefed them on what you told me. We'd like to record a formal statement, if you're willing. I'm willing. For the next 3 hours, Keisha went through everything again. This time it was being recorded. This time there were multiple people asking questions, cross-referencing details, building a picture of what had happened inside that facility. They asked about other detainees she had seen, about any conversations she had overheard, about the general atmosphere and treatment she had witnessed beyond her own experience. Keisha answered everything as completely as she could. When they finally finished, Agent Foster walked her to the lobby. The sun was setting outside, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. What happens now? Keisha asked. Now we investigate. Properly this time. Your testimony gives us enough to open a full-scale inquiry. We'll be looking at records, interviewing staff, talking to other detainees past and present. Agent Foster paused. This won't be quick. And it won't be easy. The people you've described, they're going to push back. They have friends. They have resources. They're going to try to discredit you. Keisha thought about Officer Dalton, about the way he had looked at her through that cell window, about all the people who had suffered before her and been silenced. I know, she said. I'm not going anywhere. Agent Foster studied her for a long moment. Then, for the first time, she smiled. It was small, just a slight curve of her lips, but it was real. When you applied for our training program, your recommendation letter said you had uncommon courage. I didn't know what that meant then. She extended her hand and Keisha shook it. I think I'm starting to understand now. We'll be in touch. Keisha walked out of the building and finally pulled out her phone. She had one more thing to do. Before this day was over, she called her mother. The phone barely rang once before her mother answered, her voice thick with worry and relief and a dozen other emotions all tangled together. Baby? Is that you? Where have you been? We've been looking everywhere. Are you okay? What happened? Keisha felt tears prick at her eyes for the first time in 3 days. She had held herself together through everything. The arrest. The cell. The interrogation. But hearing her mother's voice broke something loose inside her. I'm okay, Mama, she said, her voice cracking. I'm okay. I'm coming home. And I have a lot to tell you. The weeks that followed were some of the strangest of Keisha's life. On the surface, everything went back to normal. She returned to work at the law firm. She finished her law school applications. She had dinner with her family on Sundays and tried to act like everything was fine, but underneath that surface, a storm was building. Agent Foster called her regularly with updates. The investigation had officially begun. Federal agents were quietly pulling records from the detention center going back 5 years. They were reviewing complaint files, medical records, incident reports. They were tracking down former detainees and former employees who might be willing to talk. What they found was worse than anyone had expected. The complaints alone filled 3 boxes. Dozens of people over the years had tried to report mistreatment at that facility. Excessive force. Denial of medical care. Solitary confinement used as punishment without proper documentation. Food withheld. Basic hygiene supplies denied. The stories were all different, but they painted the same picture. A place where certain guards operated without accountability. A system designed to protect the abusers and silence the victims, and at the center of it all was Officer Dalton. His personnel file should have been a red flag years ago. 17 formal complaints had been filed against him since he started working at the facility, 17, and every single one had been dismissed after an internal review. The same supervisor had signed off on every dismissal. The same language was used each time. Insufficient evidence. Complaint unfounded. No further action required. It was like reading the same story over and over again. Someone would port Galton for misconduct. The complaint would be investigated by people who worked alongside him every day. And somehow, mysteriously, no evidence would ever be found, but the federal investigators weren't bound by those internal reviews. They had subpoena power. They had forensic accountants. They had access to records that the facility administrators thought had been buried forever. 3 weeks into the investigation, Agent Foster called Keisha with news. "We found 3 other people willing to testify," she said. "Former detainees who experienced treatment similar to yours. 2 women and 1 man. They've been scared to come forward until now, but when they heard someone else was speaking up, they decided to add their voices." Keisha felt something loosen in her chest. She wasn't alone anymore. Others were standing with her. "There's more," Agent Foster continued. "One of the former employees has agreed to cooperate. A nurse who worked at the facility for 8 years. She has documentation. Medical records she copied before she quit. Records that show injuries consistent with abuse that were officially attributed to accidents or self-harm. This was the breakthrough they needed. Physical evidence. Medical documentation. Testimony from someone who had worked inside the system, but as the investigation grew stronger, so did the pushback. It started small. A local news station ran a story questioning the federal investigation. They interviewed the head of the police union, who called it a witch hunt. He said the detention center had an excellent record. He said the accusations were exaggerated by people with grudges. He said Keisha Williams was a disgruntled former detainee looking for a payday. Keisha watched that interview from her apartment, her hands shaking with anger. She had never asked for money. She had never asked for attention. All she had done was tell the truth about what happened to her, but the interview was just the beginning. Strange things started happening. Her car got a flat tire in the parking lot at work, and when she checked, the tire had been slashed. Someone left a note on her windshield with a single word, scrawled in red marker, "Liar." Her mother started getting phone calls at odd hours. Heavy breathing on the line, then silence. Her sister reported being followed home from work by a car that sat outside her house for 20 minutes before driving away. Keisha reported everything to Agent Foster. The FBI took it seriously. They offered her protection, which she accepted. An agent started checking in with her regularly. Her family was advised to vary their routines and stay alert, but the harassment wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the doubt. Some people believed her. Her family stood by her without question. Her coworkers at the law firm were supportive. The attorney she worked with told her she was brave and offered legal advice whenever she needed it, but others weren't so sure. She saw it in the sideways glances from acquaintances. She heard it in the careful way some people asked questions like they were trying to catch her in a lie. Social media was even worse. People who had never met her, who knew nothing about her life or her experience, felt entitled to share their opinions about her character. She's just looking for attention. She probably did something to deserve it. Why should we believe her over the police? Reading those comments felt like being back in that cell again, cold, alone, voiceless, but Keisha had learned something during those 72 hours of hell. She had learned that her voice was the one thing they couldn't take from her. Not unless she let them. She gave an interview to a journalist who had been covering civil rights issues for 20 years. She told her story calmly and clearly, the same way she had told it to the FBI. She didn't exaggerate. She didn't dramatize. She just told the truth. The article was published on a Sunday morning. By Monday afternoon, it had been shared over 100,000 times. The hashtag Justice for Keisha started trending on social media. Civil rights organizations reached out, offering support and resources. Other people who had been detained at the same facility started coming forward, adding their stories to the growing collection of evidence. The tide was turning. 2 months after the investigation began, the first arrests were made. 3 guards were taken into custody on charges of civil rights violations. Officer Dalton was one of them. The image of him being led out of his home in handcuffs appeared on the front page of every major newspaper in the state, but the arrest didn't stop there. The investigation had uncovered a network of corruption that went deeper than anyone had initially realized. Supervisors who had covered up complaints, administrators who had falsified records, even a local official who had received payments to make certain problems disappear, one by one. They were all exposed. The administrator who had run the facility for 12 years resigned in disgrace. 2 supervisors were indicted on obstruction of justice charges. The local official was arrested at his office in front of his entire staff. Through it all, Keisha stayed focused. She met with prosecutors to prepare her testimony for the trials that would eventually come. She spoke with other victims, offering support and encouragement. She worked with civil rights attorneys to ensure that the people who had been harmed would have a path to justice. It wasn't easy. There were days when she wanted to give up. Days when the pressure felt too heavy and the criticism felt too loud. Days when she wondered if any of it was worth the cost. On those days, she would think about the voice through the vent. The woman who had told her she wasn't the first. The dozen or more people who had suffered in silence, because they didn't think anyone would believe them. She was doing this for them too. 6 months after her arrest, Keisha received a phone call from Agent Foster. "The grand jury has returned indictments," she said. 12 officers total, including Dalton. They're facing multiple federal charges. Civil rights violations, conspiracy, obstruction. Some of them are looking at serious time. Keisha sat down on her couch and let out a breath she felt like she had been holding for half a year. "It's really happening," she said quietly. "It's really happening. And Keisha, none of this would have been possible without you. You know that, right? You started this. You were the one who refused to stay silent." After they hung up, Keisha sat alone in her apartment for a long time. The sun was setting outside her window, the same orange and pink sky she had seen the day she walked out of the FBI field office all those months ago. She had started this journey as a victim. But somewhere along the way, she had become something else entirely. She had become the voice for everyone who had been told their voice didn't matter, and she was just getting started. The courtroom was packed on the day Officer Dalton was sentenced. Every seat was taken. Reporters lined the walls with their notebooks and cameras. Family members of victims sat in the front rows, their faces tight with emotion. Keisha was among them, wearing a simple black dress and sitting between her mother and her sister. It had been 18 months since that night when flashing lights appeared in her rearview mirror. 18 months of investigations, depositions, hearings, and sleepless nights. 18 months of fighting a battle that sometimes felt impossible to win, but here she was. And so was he. Officer Dalton sat at the defense table in an orange jumpsuit, his wrists in handcuffs. He looked smaller than Keisha remembered. The arrogance that had filled his face when he stood outside her cell was gone. Now he just looked tired and old and beaten. The judge entered and everyone rose. The proceedings moved quickly through the formalities. The charges were read aloud. Civil rights violations, conspiracy to deprive citizens of their constitutional rights, obstruction of justice. The evidence had been overwhelming. The jury had deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning a guilty verdict on all counts. Now it was time for sentencing. The prosecutor spoke first, laying out the extent of Dalton's crimes. Years of abuse, dozens of victims, a pattern of cruelty that had been enabled by a system designed to protect him. He asked for the maximum sentence allowed under the law. Then it was time for victim impact statements. Keisha had thought long and hard about whether she wanted to speak. Part of her just wanted this to be over. Part of her wanted to walk away and never think about that detention center again. But there was another part of her, a stronger part, that knew she had to stand up one more time. When her name was called, she rose from her seat and walked to the front of the courtroom. She could feel everyone's eyes on her. The reporters, the families, the judge, and Dalton, who refused to meet her gaze. She had written out what she wanted to say, but when she stood at the podium, she folded the paper and put it in her pocket. She didn't need notes for this. 18 months ago, I was arrested for a crime I didn't commit, she began, her voice steady. I was held for 3 days in conditions that no human being should ever have to endure. I was put in solitary confinement without cause. I was denied food. I was denied warmth. I was denied basic dignity. And through it all, I was told that I was nothing, that I didn't matter, that no one would believe me even if I tried to speak up. She paused, letting the words settle over the silent courtroom. But I did speak up, and I was believed. Not because I was special, but because I happened to have training that taught me how to document what was happening to me, how to remember details that could be used as evidence, how to stay calm when everything inside me wanted to fall apart. She turned slightly, looking at the families in the front rows, the other victims who had come forward, the people whose suffering had finally been acknowledged. I was lucky. So many others weren't. They went through the same things I did, sometimes worse, and they had no way to prove it. Their complaints were ignored. Their voices were silenced. They were made to feel like they were the problem, not the people who were hurting them. Now she looked directly at Dalton. He still wouldn't meet her eyes. What you did wasn't just about me. It was about power. The power to hurt people who couldn't fight back. The power to hide behind a badge and a system that protected you instead of the people you were supposed to serve. You thought that power made you untouchable. Her voice hardened slightly. You were wrong. She turned back to the judge. I'm not here to ask for vengeance. I'm here to ask for accountability. For myself. For everyone who suffered in that facility. And for everyone who might have suffered in the future if this had been allowed to continue. Whatever sentence you give today, I hope it sends a message. That abuse of power has consequences. That victims deserve to be heard. That justice, even when it takes too long, is still possible. She stepped away from the podium and returned to her seat. Her mother squeezed her hand, tears streaming down her face. Her sister put an arm around her shoulders. The judge took a long moment before speaking. When he did, his voice was heavy with the weight of everything he had heard over the course of the trial. In my 30 years on the bench, I have seen many cases of misconduct. But what was uncovered in this investigation represents a profound betrayal of public trust. The defendant was entrusted with authority over vulnerable people. He used that authority to inflict suffering. And he did so believing he would never be held accountable. The judge looked directly at Dalton. He was wrong. The sentence came down. 7 years in federal prison. It was one of the longest sentences ever given for civil rights violations in the state. Dalton showed no reaction as he was led away in handcuffs, but for Kaisha, the sentencing was just one piece of a much larger picture dot in the months that followed. The full scope of the reforms became clear. The facility where she had been held was placed under federal oversight. New policies were implemented for handling complaints. Body cameras became mandatory for all guards. An independent review board was established to investigate allegations of misconduct. 11 other officers faced charges as a result of the investigation. Some pleaded guilty to avoid trial. Others were convicted. The administrator who had covered up years of abuse was sentenced to 3 years in prison. The local official who had taken bribes was removed from office and faced his own criminal proceedings, but Kaisha knew that punishment alone wasn't enough. The system that had allowed this to happen needed to change from the inside out. And she intended to be part of that change. She used a portion of the settlement she received to start a nonprofit organization. She called it the Justice Project. Its mission was simple: provide legal resources to incarcerated individuals who had experienced abuse, train community members to recognize and document civil rights violations, advocate for policy reforms that would prevent future misconduct. The first year was hard. Funding was tight. The work was emotionally draining. There were days when Kaisha wondered if she was making any difference at all, but then the letters started coming. Emails from people who had used her organization's resources to file complaints that were actually investigated. Messages from families who had finally gotten answers about what had happened to their loved ones. Notes from young people who said her story had inspired them to pursue careers in law or civil rights advocacy. One letter in particular stayed with her. It was from a woman who had been detained at the same facility years before Keisha. She had tried to report what happened to her, but no one had listened. She had given up. She had buried the memories and tried to move on, but when she saw Keisha's story on the news, something changed. "You made me believe that my voice mattered," the woman wrote. "That what happened to me wasn't my fault. That I wasn't crazy or making things up. I can't change the past. But because of you, I finally feel like I can stop carrying it alone." Keisha read that letter at her desk in the small office she had rented for the Justice Project. She read it 3 times and then she cried. Not from sadness, but from something else. Something that felt like hope. 2 years after her arrest, Keisha started law school. She had put it off long enough. The applications that had been sitting on her kitchen table that night were long since submitted and accepted. She enrolled in one of the best programs in the state, on a full scholarship established for students. Committed to public interest law, she graduated 3 years later at the top of her class. Her thesis on systemic reform in detention facilities became required reading in criminal justice programs across the country. Professors cited it. Advocates referenced it. Policymakers used it to push for legislation. At her graduation ceremony, the dean introduced her with words that made her mother cry all over again. A woman who turned her darkest moment into a light for thousands. Keisha walked across that stage, accepted her diploma, and looked out at the audience. Her family was there. Agent Foster was there. Some of the other victims who had become her friends were there. She thought about that cold cell. The hunger. The fear. The voice through the vent telling her she wasn't the first. She had been just another person caught in a broken system. But she had refused to stay silent. And because of that, the system itself had begun to change. After the ceremony, a reporter asked her what advice she would give to others facing injustice. Keisha smiled. Document everything. Tell your story. And never let anyone convince you that your voice doesn't matter. Because it does. It always does. She walked out into the sunlight, surrounded by the people she loved, ready for whatever came next. Her story wasn't ending. It was just beginning a new chapter.